Ilric Mevan was once known as the most trusted gynecologist in West Grendale, respected, admired, even celebrated. But behind his calm voice and polished smile hid a predator who spent over 3 decades violating the very women who came to him for care. Rhea Morlin was only 19 when she walked into his clinic, hoping for reassurance. What she left with was trauma so deep, it took her years to speak out. And when she finally did, the horrifying truth unraveled. Dozens of women, the same story, the same man, and a chilling trail of silence that lasted far too long. For nearly 3 decades, Dr. Ilric Mevan held a spotless reputation in the city of West Grendale. With his crisp white coat, steady hands, and calm voice, he was trusted by thousands of women. His clinic, Mevan Women's Health Center, was considered one of the most respected private practices in the region. Situated on a quiet corner surrounded by blooming maple trees and ivy-covered fences, the clinic looked more like a wellness retreat than a medical facility. The waiting room always smelled of lavender, soft music played in the background, and framed certificates lined the walls behind the reception desk. It was a place that promised safety and professionalism. For many women, it became the only place they felt comfortable discussing intimate health matters. Dr. Mevan specialized in obstetrics and gynecology, and over time became the go-to doctor for pregnant women, teens experiencing their first cycle, and middle-aged patients facing menopause. He had delivered hundreds of babies, some of whom returned years later as young women for their first checkups. People referred to him with affection and respect. Dr. Mevan is gentle, they would say. He explains everything, he listens. His popularity made him untouchable in the community. He appeared on local health panels, contributed articles to women's magazines, and gave talks in high schools about reproductive health. Yet, behind that polished image was a dark, hidden truth that no one saw, or perhaps no one dared to believe. Several patients would often leave his office feeling confused or uneasy, unsure why a routine examination had felt so invasive. Some chalked it up to their own discomfort with medical procedures. Others convinced themselves that maybe they were just overthinking. After all, it was Dr. Mevan. He was the best. Who were they to question him? Subtle signs were always there. He insisted on being alone with his patients during certain procedures, claiming it helped them feel more at ease without an assistant or nurse in the room. The clinic had a policy that allowed women to decline a chaperone during intimate exams, and many did, partly due to his calming tone, partly due to trust. Over time, these private moments became opportunities for him to violate boundaries in horrifying ways. One woman, now in her 40s, remembered how something felt off during her annual exam when she was just 23. She recalled the coldness in his eyes, the way he avoided her gaze after the procedure, and the pain that lingered longer than usual. But she never spoke about it. She didn't want to be dramatic. That story, in different forms, was repeated, silently across the city by countless others. His staff, mostly young nurses and rotating interns, never stayed long. Many resigned within months. Their departures were explained away with excuses like moving to another city, looking for better opportunities, or pursuing education. No one looked deeper into why the turnover was so high. The ones who stayed longer never had access to the private exam rooms. The records were tightly controlled, and Dr. Mevan managed all sensitive appointments personally. Even the medical boards and inspection authorities had only praise for him. He always complied during inspections. His patient satisfaction scores were nearly perfect. There were no formal complaints on record, and those who might have tried to raise a red flag often changed their minds or backed away before completing a report. It was as if the walls of his clinic absorbed the truth and buried it in silence. Over the years, Mevan grew bolder. He began seeing patients during after-hours emergency appointments, especially single women or teenagers. He claimed it was a community service, that he wanted to be available to women in crisis. Parents were grateful, patients relieved, but these late-night sessions became his most dangerous acts of manipulation. No one imagined that the man who held babies in his arms and smiled at grieving mothers was capable of evil. The community had elevated him to the level of a local hero. And as his power grew, so did his confidence that no one would ever discover what really went on behind the locked doors of Mevan Women's Health Center. Kaela Tonnin was just 24 when she joined Mevan Women's Health Center as a licensed practical nurse. Fresh out of nursing school and full of ambition, she felt lucky to have landed a position at one of the most well-known clinics in West Grendale. Dr. Ilric Mevan's name carried weight, not just in medical circles, but among the general public. Her friends and family were impressed. It felt like the beginning of a bright future. From the first day, Kaela was struck by how quiet the clinic was. It was efficient, yes, and organized, but it lacked the usual hum of collaboration she had seen during her hospital rotations. Staff didn't chat casually. Most of them kept to themselves, and there was an invisible wall between the front desk, the nurses, and Dr. Mevan himself. He was polite but distant. He rarely spoke more than necessary, and almost never made eye contact. His presence felt heavy, not comforting. Kaela's responsibilities were limited. She took vitals, prepared patients for examinations, and occasionally assisted with prenatal consultations. But she noticed a pattern that quickly began to bother her. Dr. Mevan would often insist on being alone with patients for exams. He would instruct Kaela to wait outside, even during procedures where a chaperone was typically recommended. He would explain that the patients preferred privacy, or that having too many people in the room made them anxious. It seemed plausible at first, but it happened far too often. There were other things that didn't sit right with her. Medical records were sometimes incomplete. Notes from physical exams were unusually vague, with details missing or entire sections left blank. Kaela once asked another nurse about it, but the response was evasive, just a shrug and a warning to not get involved in things that didn't concern her. That struck her as odd, especially in a clinic that prided itself on professionalism. Over time, Kaela began to witness the aftermath of some of these private appointments. Patients, especially younger women, would emerge from the exam rooms looking shaken. Some were teary-eyed, others seemed withdrawn. When Kaela would ask if everything was all right, they would offer a forced smile or quickly change the subject. One particular patient, a college student named Lorna, sat in the waiting area for almost 20 minutes after her exam, visibly distressed. She wouldn't speak to Kaela and left abruptly when her name was called again. Kaela couldn't stop, thinking about her for days. Determined to understand what was going on, Kaela began keeping quiet notes in a private journal at home. She recorded dates, times, and the reactions of patients after their appointments. She didn't know exactly what she was documenting, only that something wasn't right. As weeks turned into months, her suspicions grew heavier. The more she observed, the more she realized that the problem wasn't just occasional, it was systematic. When she finally gathered the courage to approach the clinic's manager, a woman named Bryn Durrell, she was met with cold resistance. Bryn dismissed her observations immediately, suggesting Kaela was inexperienced and letting her imagination get the best of her. She told her not to make accusations she couldn't back up and warned her that false allegations could ruin lives. Kaela left the office humiliated and confused. Within 2 weeks, Kaela was placed on a performance improvement plan. Her work was suddenly being criticized. Minor mistakes were blown out of proportion. She was given shifts that didn't match her availability. Eventually, she was called in and told that her contract would not be renewed due to incompatibility with the clinic's standards. No formal reason was provided. She was asked to pack her things and leave by the end of the day. Kaela left the clinic with a storm of unanswered questions swirling inside her. She had no concrete evidence, only the weight of what she'd seen and sensed. But even after leaving, the feeling of unease didn't fade. She couldn't forget the looks on the patients' faces. She couldn't stop wondering how many of them had been harmed, and how long it had been going on. Something terrible was hiding beneath the calm surface of Mevan Women's Health Center, and now Kaela was no longer in a position to stop it. But the thought of staying silent haunted her every day. In the fall of 2006, a 19-year-old college freshman named Rhea Morlin walked into Mevan Women's Health Center for her first ever gynecological exam. Like many young women, she was nervous, uncertain about what to expect. She had chosen the clinic because it was highly recommended and because Dr. Ilric Mevan was known for being gentle and professional. At the time, she believed she was in the safest hands, but what happened during that appointment left her feeling confused, embarrassed, and deeply violated. After leaving the clinic, Rhea spent the evening trying to rationalize what she had experienced. She kept telling herself that she just didn't know how these exams were supposed to feel, that maybe it was normal. But deep down, she knew something had gone wrong. She felt as though her personal space had been invaded in a way that no medical procedure could justify. For days, she couldn't sleep. She told no one. Instead, she turned to the internet, looking for answers and reading medical forums, hoping to find reassurance. What she found only confirmed her fears. Eventually, Rhea decided to file a complaint. She didn't want to go public, so she submitted an anonymous report to the state medical board. In her account, she described what had happened during the TE examination, pointing out that certain actions taken by Dr. Mevan felt unnecessary and inappropriate. She expressed concern that other young women might be going through the same thing. The board acknowledged receipt of the complaint and informed her that a review would be initiated. But months passed, and Rhea never heard back. No one contacted her for a follow-up. There was no inquiry, no further questions, no indication that the issue was being taken seriously. She eventually received a letter stating that the case was closed due to a lack of sufficient evidence and that the doctor in question had an otherwise unblemished record. They noted that sometimes patients misinterpret procedures due to inexperience. Feeling humiliated and defeated, Rhea buried the memory. She stopped visiting gynecologists altogether for the next several years. The clinic remained open, and Dr. Mevan continued to be praised as a trusted professional. As far as the world was concerned, nothing had ever happened. For Rhea, it became a quiet trauma she learned to live with. Years later, in 2020, Rhea was scrolling through social media when she came across a tweet that froze her in place. A woman had written about a disturbing experience she had during a routine exam at Mevan Women's Health Center. The language, the feeling, the confusion, it all mirrored what Rhea had gone through over a decade earlier. The post was gaining traction, and other women had started replying, sharing similar stories. Most described feeling uncomfortable. Some mentioned being touched in ways that didn't seem necessary, and others admitted they had been too ashamed to speak up. Rhea felt a wave of validation she had never experienced before. She wasn't alone. She hadn't imagined it. Her instincts had been right all along. For the first time since that day in 2006, she spoke up. She wrote a detailed thread sharing her experience, revealing that she had once filed a complaint that went nowhere. She didn't name herself in the beginning, but within days, journalists began reaching out. Advocacy groups offered support. Encouraged by the momentum, Rhea eventually attached her name to her story. It was a terrifying decision, but a necessary one. Once her story was public, it opened the floodgates. Within a week, over 50 women came forward with allegations against Dr. Mevan, most of them eerily similar. Some incidents were recent. Others dated back more than 20 years. Each woman had stayed silent, thinking it was just her, fearing that no one would believe them. But now, the silence was breaking. The media picked up the story quickly. News outlets began investigating Mevan's past, and local authorities could no longer ignore the accusations. The medical board was forced to reopen old cases, including Rhea's original complaint. What once had been labeled a misunderstanding was now part of a growing mountain of evidence that something deeply wrong had been happening for decades. Rhea Morlin had once walked out of that clinic believing her voice didn't matter. Now her courage had become the match that lit a fire too big to be put out. The image of Dr. Mevan as a respected healer was beginning to crumble. The world was starting to see the predator behind the mask. By early 2021, the quiet city of West Grendale was shaken by the growing scandal around Dr. Ilric Mevan. Local news stations broadcasted daily updates showing footage of his clinic, now closed, surrounded by protesters holding signs demanding justice. The man once regarded as the cornerstone of women's healthcare was now at the center of a horrifying truth. As the number of victims continued to rise, law enforcement finally took action. A formal investigation was launched by a special unit from the state's Department of Health and Human Services, working closely with a task force from the district attorney's office. Detective Brannon Sorrell, a seasoned investigator known for handling high-profile abuse cases, was assigned to lead the inquiry. He began by requesting patient records from the clinic. What they received, however, was a carefully curated and heavily edited database. Many entries were vague, missing key procedural notes, or listed under pseudonyms. A forensic team was brought in to recover deleted files from hard drives, and what they uncovered was far worse than anticipated. Hidden among routine charts were encrypted folders containing unauthorized video recordings, many from private exam rooms. The footage revealed unmistakable proof of misconduct. Patients were filmed without their consent during vulnerable procedures. The recordings, dated as far back as 2003, were stored meticulously and categorized by age and appointment type. The videos were disturbing not only for their content, but for what they represented. A pattern of abuse that had been methodically carried out for nearly 30 years. Authorities arrested Dr. Ilric Mevan in the early hours of February 3, 2021. The arrest took place quietly, with no warning to the media. He was found at his private residence just outside the city, a sprawling estate with high walls and motion-activated gates. When officers searched his home, they discovered more damning evidence: USB drives, handwritten logs, and concealed documents hidden in a false bottom drawer in his study. Everything pointed to a man who had spent decades perfecting the concealment of his crimes. Once in custody, Mevan refused to speak. His legal team immediately filed motions to block the release of evidence, arguing that the materials were collected unlawfully. The court rejected these attempts. A grand jury was swiftly convened, and charges began stacking up: over 70 counts of sexual assault, multiple counts of unauthorized surveillance, and obstruction of justice. As the legal process unfolded, the true scope of the damage became clearer. Victims ranged in age from 16 to 54. Some were former staff members. Others were mothers who had once brought their daughters to him. Kaela Tonnin, the former nurse who had long suspected something was wrong, was asked to testify. Her handwritten notes from years earlier became key evidence in corroborating victim timelines. For the first time, her warnings were heard. She recalled the discomfort she witnessed in patients, the efforts to silence her, and the strange administrative behavior she experienced before being let go. Her testimony carried the weight of someone who had tried to stop the harm but was dismissed. Meanwhile, more victims continued to come forward. Many had relocated, started families, or built lives far from West Grendale, but the news triggered memories too painful to ignore. Some shared their stories anonymously, while others like Rhea Morlin stood in court and faced their abuser. Their courage reshaped the narrative. The case became not just a trial of one man, but a reckoning for an entire system that allowed him to operate unchallenged. The medical board was forced to undergo a full audit. Several former officials were investigated for negligence. Bryn Durrell, the clinic manager who had ignored Kaela's concerns, resigned under public pressure. Investigators found she had knowledge of patient complaints and had failed to report them. Her silence allowed Mevan to continue for years, unchecked. As the trial approached, the community faced a bitter truth. For decades, they had revered a man who preyed on the very people who trusted him most. The fallout was widespread. Families questioned their memories, institutions scrambled to repair trust, and survivors grappled with the reality that justice, though long overdue, was finally within reach. The court proceedings were just beginning, but the weight of truth had already begun to shift the world that Ilric Mevan had so carefully manipulated. The courtroom was packed on the day Dr. Ilric Mevan's trial began. Survivors, reporters, attorneys, and members of the community filled every seat, while others waited outside, watching live broadcasts on their phones. The air was heavy with anticipation. After decades of silence and cover-ups, the case was finally laid bare before the world. What had started as whispers from traumatized women had now transformed into one of the largest criminal cases against a medical professional in the state's history. The prosecution opened with a powerful narrative, one built on decades of meticulous abuse, betrayal of trust, and calculated deception. They laid out a timeline showing how Mevan had begun preying on his patients in the early 1990s, using his reputation as a shield against suspicion. He had built a fortress around himself, one that included loyal staff members, an intimidating legal team, and a carefully curated public image. The videos recovered from the clinic, the handwritten journals found in his home, and the suppressed complaints dating back years were presented as undeniable proof of his guilt. Each day in court brought new testimonies. Survivors stood at the witness stand, trembling but determined. They described in chilling detail the confusion, fear, and shame they had felt during their appointments. Many had doubted themselves for years, assuming they were overreacting or misunderstanding standard procedures. Some had even returned for follow-up visits, blaming their discomfort on inexperience. Now, hearing their stories one after another, it became clear that the pattern was too precise, too intentional, to be anything but deliberate abuse. The defense attempted to frame Mevan as a victim of mass hysteria, arguing that he had served thousands of patients over 3 decades and that misunderstandings were inevitable. They claimed the clinic's security recordings were taken out of context and that some of the accusers were exaggerating events for media attention. But their arguments failed to stand against the overwhelming physical evidence and the consistency of the testimonies. There were simply too many women with nearly identical stories. Kaela Tonnin returned to the courtroom, this time not as a nurse, but as a key witness in a historic trial. Her detailed records of suspicious patient reactions and administrative inconsistencies became essential in proving the ongoing nature of the crimes. She was praised by the prosecution for her bravery in trying to expose the truth, even when her warnings had been ignored. Her presence in court sent a strong message. Silence may have won for a while, but not forever. The most pivotal moment came when Rhea Morlin testified. Her story, once dismissed by the medical board as a misunderstanding, was now central to the prosecution's argument. She spoke calmly, but every word carried weight. She recalled how her complaint had been swept aside and how that failure allowed Mevan to keep harming others. Her strength and clarity inspired a shift in the courtroom. Even jurors seemed visibly moved by her testimony. After 4 weeks of intense proceedings, the jury retired for deliberation. It took them less than 2 days to reach a unanimous verdict. Dr. Ilric Mevan was found guilty on all counts: sexual assault, unlawful surveillance, obstruction of justice, and medical malpractice. The judge sentenced him to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was read aloud, gasps and tears filled the courtroom. For many, it was the closure they thought they'd never receive. The aftermath of the trial brought sweeping changes. The state introduced new legislation mandating chaperones during all intimate medical procedures, along with stricter reporting guidelines for patient complaints. The medical board underwent a complete overhaul, and a victims' advocacy center was established in West Grendale, offering support to survivors of professional misconduct. Dr. Mevan's name, once spoken with reverence, was now synonymous with betrayal. His clinic was torn down, replaced by a memorial garden dedicated to the women who had suffered in silence. Their stories, once buried under shame and disbelief, were now permanently etched into the city's history. Though justice had been served in the courtroom, the journey for healing had only just begun. For the women who came forward, the trial was not the end of their pain, but it was the end of hiding. And for future generations, their courage ensured that monsters in white coats would no longer be protected by silence.